Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Young here and welcome to part 2 of the E3 2014 trailer analysis. I was blown away by all the feedback I got from part 1, so I was compelled to compile and share all the new information, theories, and interpretations that you guys had to offer. The following video is very much a culmination of your contributions, so I just want to say thank you. Now before I begin, I do recommend that you watch part 1 if you haven't done so yet, since I am going to be presenting information under the assumption that you've watched it, and you can do so by clicking on the annotation or the link in the description below. So with that out of the way, without further ado, let's dive right into it. I would like to begin by discussing the funeral ceremony towards the beginning of the trailer. In my previous video, under the assumption that these caskets house the few bodies that Kaz managed to recover from Ground Zeroes, I talked about how strange it was for Snake to be performing a funeral ceremony for 9-year-old corpses. But many of you argued that these corpses may actually belong to members of Diamond Dogs that perished from a recent tragedy that took place sometime between the hospital scene at the beginning of the game and Kaz's rescue. As it turns out, you guys might be onto something. During the cutscene at the beginning of the latest gameplay presentation, Ocelot actually provides information corroborating that there was indeed some kind of recent incident which resulted in the loss of Diamond Dog soldiers.
Not one of Miller's bodyguards survived. And they were good.
According to his intel, Kaz had assembled an elite team and went to Afghanistan, likely to follow up on some kind of lead pertaining to those responsible for the destruction of Mother Base. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned, Kaz was taken prisoner, and everyone else was killed in action. So it's possible that the corpses in these caskets are Diamond Dog soldiers who perished in Afghanistan. This certainly makes more sense, and in retrospect, this would explain why these caskets are blanketed by Diamond Dogs flags instead of MSF flags. Speaking of Diamond Dogs and MSF, in my previous video, I pointed out that Snake was wearing an MSF insignia on the padding on his right arm, stating that it was another way for Snake to memorialize those who perished 9 years ago. But as it turns out, the padding on his right arm is mostly there to represent his former unit. I did some research, and these insignias that Snake wears on the upper shoulder section of his arms are called shoulder sleeve insignias, and it is American formality to wear the insignia of the current unit on the left, in this case Diamond Dogs, and the insignia of the former unit on the right, in this case MSF. Snake actually follows the same formality in Peace Walker and Ground Zeroes, during which he wears the insignia of his former unit, Fox, on the right, and the insignia of his current unit, MSF, on the left. Not to say that Snake just wears the MSF logo as a formality, I'm sure he wears it with pride to remember his fallen comrades. Now, as we all know from watching the trailer, Big Boss's plan for honoring these men is to turn their ashes into diamonds instead of scattering them into the sea. In my previous video, the way I interpreted Big Boss's intentions was to turn them into diamond rocks, but as many of you pointed out, Big Boss and Kaz may have something more extravagant in mind based on what they say towards the end of the trailer.
We'll make diamonds from their ashes. We'll take them into battle with us. A shining light to our brothers in arms, even in death.
The key phrase here is, take them into battle with us. It wouldn't make sense to take diamond rocks into battle, so the assumption that many of you made, and I really like this one, is that the ashes of these comrades will be used to make diamond-edged knives. These are essentially knives that are embedded with incredibly thin diamonds on the sharp edge, which not only makes these knives extremely sharp, like surgically sharp, but also make them incredibly durable. What better way to take the spirits of fallen comrades into battle for vengeance than by edging their remains on knives that Diamond Dogs will use to spill the blood of those responsible? It's almost poetic if you think about it. Further corroborating this theory are the glimmers that emanate from the knives that are shown in this trailer. Notice how the glimmers always seem to appear on the sharp edge of the knives, perhaps as a cause of light reflecting from the edged diamonds. Now, another interesting theory for the glimmers is that they are visual warnings and cues for gameplay rather than the reflection of etched diamonds. Keep in mind that in Ground Zeroes, lens flares weren't just there for cinematic effect, but also to warn players of approaching enemies. So it's certainly possible that the lens flares on the knives also serve as some kind of visual warning. Perhaps these lens flares are similar to the counter cues found in the Arkham games, allowing players to counter knife attacks from enemy soldiers by timing button presses to the knife's glint. What do you think? Do these glimmers come from the etched diamond's reflection? Do you think it's some kind of gameplay visual cue, or do you have something else in mind? On the topic of diamonds, I would like to go back to this scene from last year's trailer, in which we see a number of Africans trapped inside a cell holding out diamonds. In my previous video, I talked about the possibility that these diamonds are cremation diamonds that were somehow stolen from diamond dogs, since that seems to be the only logical reason that I can think of for Big Boss being pissed enough to kill these helpless prisoners. You can even see Big Boss picking up one of the diamonds and sort of checking it out to possibly verify that these are his cremation diamonds. But something I never noticed before until it was recently pointed out to me was that one of the Africans in this cell is also one of the child soldiers that Big Boss brings to Mother Base in the latest trailer, which could change the context of the scene dramatically depending on the chronology of these scenes. If the kid is brought to Mother Base first before he ends up in the cell, then one possible explanation is that he somehow finds these cremation diamonds and steals them, resulting in the scenario in which Big Boss tracks him down to this cell and kills everyone in there for stealing his comrades, so to speak. Now, if the kid is rescued from the cell and then brought to Mother Base, then the kid couldn't have stolen anything from diamond dogs. So in this scenario, these are likely just raw diamonds. So perhaps Big Boss is shooting at the cell doors with the intention of freeing and rescuing them. It's hard to say for sure since both scenarios have their fair share of inconsistencies. For example, if the kid steals cremation diamonds before ending up in a cell, then how the hell did he escape from an offshore facility? What about the fact that they are diamond rocks instead of diamonds etched into knives? Then again, it's possible that not all cremation diamonds have been etched, or that the diamond-etched knives theory just isn't true. As for the scenario in which the kid is rescued from his cell and then brought to Mother Base, where are those other two kids? And what happens to the rest of the prisoners, like the old African women? Furthermore, why is Big Boss shooting so wildly if he's just shooting at a door? There are just too many unknown variables to plot out something concrete. Let us know in the comments below your thoughts on which scenario is more likely, and if you happen to think of any other ideas, be sure to share them as well. Speaking of child soldiers, I would like to revisit this scene showing a struggle between Eli, aka Young Liquid, and Big Boss. More specifically, I would like to talk about the things drawn on the back of Eli's shirt. I've already talked about how the Japanese symbols on his shirt translate to Liquid Man, and about the pig with the eye patch that resembles Big Boss, but I didn't have many ideas for the phrase written in English, which says, "Never be game over." But many of you pointed out that the phrase could perhaps be a reference to a famous line that Liquid says in the final chapter of Metal Gear Solid 1.
Not yet, Snake! It's not over yet!
Anyone who's played MGS1 will know that Liquid is one of the most tenacious sons of bitches out there, having lived all his life with the false knowledge that he represented the inferior genes of Big Boss. He was just unwilling to give up until he proved his superiority. So it's quite possible that the phrase, "never be game over," pays homage to Liquid's tenacity, since the man is practically the personification of the phrase, "it's not over yet." Moving on, I would like to talk about this particular scene in which we get to witness a Diamond Dog soldier, or somebody dressed as one, taking aim at Big Boss. I theorized in my previous video that these choppers were perhaps returning to base from a mission in which the enemy killed and took the place of one of Big Boss's men, hiding in plain sight and waiting for an opportune time for an assassination. But since the individual is wearing a mask, it was hard for me to say who this could be. The most popular assumption is that this individual is quiet in disguise, with many people noting that the eyes and eyebrows look somewhat feminine. I myself would like to add that the Metal Gear franchise does seem to have a tradition of disguising female characters for infiltration purposes. For example, Holly White and Gustava Hefner both dressed up as Zanzibar Land soldiers during the Zanzibar Land disturbance. Meryl Silverberg disguised herself as a genome soldier during the Shadow Moses incident. Olga Gorlukovich disguised herself as the Cyborg Ninja during the Big Shell incident, and Eva disguised herself as KGB operative Tatiana during Operation Snake Eater. So who's to say that Quiet won't disguise herself as a Diamond Dog soldier? And for those saying that this person's body seems too manly to be Quiet, Keep in mind that both Holly White and Gustava Hefner managed to pass off as men in Zanzibar land, where there were no female guards. Furthermore, this Diamond Dog's outfit seems to be loose enough to easily hide feminine features. If this does turn out to be quiet in disguise, this could be a possible explanation for how she managed to get inside Mother Base and why she is eventually interrogated. Alright, now that I've gotten the smaller theories out of the way, it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, Metal Gear. In my previous video, I explained why this cannot be Rex from MGS1, with the biggest inconsistency being timeline, since development on Rex began in 2002. So my assumption was that this Metal Gear is a new model serving as a prototype for Metal Gear Rex, or the inspiration behind Rex. However, one obvious assumption I failed to mention that many of you pointed out was that this could be none other than Metal Gear Zeke, which most likely survived the attack on Mother Base during the events of Ground Zeroes. Hinting at its survival is this audio tape from Ground Zeroes. Take a listen.
We finished Zeke's waterproofing reinforcement yesterday. The day after tomorrow we'll be done installing the main depth control tank, the compressed air tank, and the attitude control propeller pod.
Huey.
If the underwater test goes well, next week we'll try the 300-foot seabed depth.
Drop the act, Huey. How did we end up agreeing to the nuclear inspection?
As you heard, Huey mentions installing equipment on Zeke that will allow it to remain hundreds of feet underwater. So the most likely scenario is that Zeke was submerged underwater during the attack and was most likely out of harm's way. As for how Skullface and his XOF unit managed to retrieve it, keep in mind that there are signs indicating that Huey was complicit in Skullface's plan, so Huey could have easily made contact with Skullface to tell him Zeke's exact location. Hell, maybe hiding Zeke underwater was Skullface's idea and not Huey's. Furthermore, if you recall from Chico's tapes, Skullface eventually managed to get Chico talking.
How did Zeke? Staff of 300? But usually there's... Zeke. And again.
It's certainly possible that Chico knew about Metal Gear Zeke being hidden underwater, since the underwater equipment was being installed before Chico went after Paz. So bottom line, it's highly likely that Zeke survived the attack and that Skullface knew exactly where to look for it, explaining why Zeke is under Skullface's possession. Further corroborating the possibility that this is Metal Gear Zeke are its legs. They are far too skinny to be Rex's, but if we compare them to Zeke's, you will notice that the thickness of the legs match. But what about the head? It definitely resembles Rex more than anything. Perhaps this head is one of the many enhancements that Skullface made to Zeke using Granin's research. Those who've played Metal Gear Solid 3 may recall that Granin was the father of the bipedal weapons of mass destruction we know as Metal Gear. Unfortunately for him, the technology behind his research was too advanced for its time, which is why Volgan funded Sokolov's Shagohod instead of Granin's Metal Gear. But by the end of Operation Snake Eater, Granin's research documents and blueprints were intercepted by Triple Agent Ocelot, which he handed over to the American branch of the Philosophers. We are actually shown glimpses of these documents in a cutscene from Metal Gear Solid 3, and if we take a look, you may notice that the Metal Gear that Granin envisioned looks very similar to Metal Gear Rex. Fast forward to a decade later to 1974, and Huey begins to work on a new Metal Gear for MSF called Metal Gear Zeke, and he does so using the knowledge he gained from working on Metal Gears like Peace Walker, which were constructed using the documents and blueprints from Granin's research that Hod Coldman managed to get his hands on. So basically, Metal Gear Zeke shares a direct link to Granin's research, and at the time, Zeke was the closest to match Granin's vision of Metal Gear in that it was the first to stand on two legs. Zeke was also very similar to Granin's vision in terms of aesthetics and functionality, but it wasn't quite there yet, most notably when it came to the head. Fast forward to Phantom Pain, 1984, and an even more accurate representation of Granin's research seems to have been realized through nearly a decade's worth of technological advancement and enhancements to Zeke. It's almost as if every Metal Gear produced before Rex strived to get closer and closer to realizing the ultimate Metal Gear that Granin envisioned, with Zeke from Peace Walker being the first to come close to aesthetically resembling it, and with what I'm assuming to be a new and enhanced Zeke coming even closer. But I believe that even this Metal Gear isn't quite there yet. I believe that it's not until the Shadow Moses incident that technology becomes advanced enough to fully bring Metal Gear to life as Granin intended, and this was done through Metal Gear Rex. And it's not until after Rex that I believe research and development on Metal Gear comes to surpass Granin's vision through Metal Gear Ray and beyond. So to sum up everything, thanks to your input, I have come to believe that this Metal Gear resembling Rex is actually Peace Walker's Metal Gear Zeke, enhanced with 9 years of technological advancement, and since these enhancements were likely based off of Granin's research, which is most accurately represented by Metal Gear Rex, naturally Zeke will begin to take Rex's form as more and more of Granin's research is implemented. Now, something to keep in mind is that Zeke was customizable in Peace Walker, so who's to say that players won't be customizing their own Metal Gear in Phantom Pain? Perhaps in this game, players will have full customization options over Metal Gear's aesthetics and functionalities, and perhaps what we are seeing in this trailer is just one of many possible appearances of what I'm assuming to be Zeke. Similar to how the base we see in the trailer is just one of many possible appearances of Mother Base, since Mother Base will be fully customizable. One last thing I would like to point out that corroborates Zeke's return is this diagram released by Kojima Productions, which shows all Metal Gears from the Metal Gear Solid series in chronological order of release date except for Metal Gear Solid 5's, which is censored out. What's interesting about this diagram is that if you look closely, Metal Gear Zeke is nowhere to be found, at least as far as we can see. I personally don't think that the folks over at Kojima Productions would have any good reason to exclude Zeke from the diagram, so perhaps Zeke is the hidden Metal Gear behind the black sensor, which if true would suggest that Zeke is Metal Gear Solid 5's main Metal Gear. But keep in mind that there could be more to it than that, since in last year's trailer, Ocelot mentions that Cypher is developing a new weapon that could surpass Metal Gear.
Cypher is pursuing new research. He claims that what they're doing in Africa is the missing piece. A weapon to surpass Metal Gear.
Now, some may argue that the reason Zeke isn't included in the diagram is because it's different in that it's a Metal Gear that players control instead of the antagonist like the rest of them. But keep in mind that Phantom Pain tells the story of Big Boss's transformation into a villain, meaning that eventually players will play the antagonist. So in the end, Zeke isn't actually all that different from the others. Alright, enough about Metal Gear. Next, I want to talk about the other elephant in the room, Skullface, who somehow managed to convince Big Boss to work with him. Equally surprising is that Skullface is willing to work with Big Boss, considering he intended to kill both Big Boss and Cypher 9 years ago, and more recently in the hospital when Big Boss awoke from his coma. Now, before I discuss the topic further, I would like to point out that Skullface is not wearing an eye patch, as many of you pointed out. He is wearing what's called a domino mask, as noted by the hole through which the eye is clearly visible. We can also see him wearing it in last year's E3 trailer and in this photo of a Skullface figurine. It is without a doubt a domino mask, not an eye patch. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's talk about possible reasons for an allegiance between Big Boss and Skullface. In my previous video, I theorized that there could be some kind of falling out between Big Boss and Diamond Dogs, Kaz included, after Big Boss goes too far at some point to achieve his vendetta, and that this falling out leads to Big Boss joining forces with Skullface. I presented evidence such as all the inner conflict that seems to occur within Diamond Dogs, this final scene in which we see Big Boss killing Diamond Dog soldiers, and this codec conversation that occurs in the final battle against Big Boss in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, in which Kaz calls Big Boss a monster. Now, many of you suggested that this partnership between Big Boss and Skullface doesn't necessarily have to be about betrayal, and that it could just be about sharing a common enemy, Cypher. As the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Further corroborating these theories are these quotes from last year's E3 trailer.
We pull in money, recruits, just to combat Cypher. Rubbing our noses in bloody battlefield dirt. All for revenge. Cypher sent us to hell, but we're going even deeper. Take back everything that we've lost.
Clearly, the perception towards the beginning of Phantom Pain is that Cypher is the enemy, which is a logical assumption to make considering that the attack on Mother Base conveniently occurred a few months after Big Boss thwarted Cypher's plans during the Peace Walker incident. Perhaps one possible way for Skullface to gain Big Boss's trust is by exploiting this situation and pinning the blame for what he did on Cypher. But at the same time, I just don't see how Skullface would be able to maintain the facade for long once Big Boss and Kaz see the XOF soldiers beside him, since both Big Boss and Kaz would easily recognize the unit's distinct attire from the attack on Mother Base. Admittedly, the XOF soldiers did take off the insignias before the invasion, so there was no way for Big Boss and Kaz to identify what unit they belonged to at the time. But surely they would recognize their uniforms if they saw the soldiers again, and surely they would suspect Skullface if they saw him leading these soldiers. Big Boss would especially remember them, since they massacred the hospital in which Big Boss awoke from his coma. Perhaps Skullface manages to convince Big Boss and Kaz that the soldiers were sent under Cypher's orders and not his. After all, Skullface was an agent of Cypher, so it's possible to believe that Cypher has a large influence over Skullface's XOF unit. As for why Big Boss would trust him, keep in mind that in one of Chico's tapes from Ground Zeroes, Skullface hints that the two go way back.
Your boss and I go way back. Don't count on him coming to rescue you.
So perhaps that has something to do with their collaboration. Some people have also noted the possibility that Big Boss is working with Skullface to take advantage of him, with the plan being to make him suffer for what he did after he has served his use. One final possibility is that the two put their differences aside for now to defeat a common enemy. If you recall, Ocelot mentions that Cypher is developing a weapon that will surpass Metal Gear. So it's possible that the threat this weapon poses far outweighs Big Boss's lust for vengeance or Skullface's obsession with killing Big Boss. Honestly, until we get more information, the possible reasons and motivations for their collaboration are endless. Now, speaking of Diamond Dogs and XOF, something that I never noticed before until recently is that Diamond Dog's choppers are identical to the XOF choppers we see in Ground Zeroes and in Phantom Pain. If we compare a Diamond Dog's chopper and an XOF chopper side by side, you will notice that the windows are all the exact same shape, the exterior modeling are identical, and most important of all, they both have the same red sideways V's pointing towards the tail. Perhaps this is suggesting that their collaboration begins much earlier than we anticipated, with Skullface contributing some equipment like choppers to Diamond Dogs. Another possibility, and this one is a bit sillier, is that these choppers were Fultoned from XOF, which is possible considering that Phantom Pain allows players to Fulton just about anything. What do you think? Moving on, I would like to discuss the final scene of the E3 2014 trailer, which shows Snake shooting and killing Diamond Dog soldiers. I use this scene as evidence for my theory that Big Boss and Diamond Dogs will have some kind of falling out, but many of you pointed out that there's just something off about this scene. All of the soldiers here just seem out of it, particularly this one soldier who just kind of walks into the scene in an almost zombie-like fashion, dismissing the bloody corpses of his comrades lying on the ground. It is almost as if these soldiers are being mind-controlled, with a popular assumption being that Psycho Mantis is responsible for this. So perhaps Big Boss had no choice but to shoot him, since it was his life or theirs. If this turns out to be true, then my theory of a falling out certainly becomes less plausible, although a possibility is that Psycho Mantis is setting up the scene to look like Big Boss has gone haywire. But until it's made certain what's making these soldiers act so weird and out of place, we can only assume. To wrap up this trailer analysis, I would like to take a look at the so-called release date, 1984. In my previous video, I had very little to say about what this could mean, except that there's a release date hidden in there somewhere, but many of you came up with a number of interesting theories. One theory is that the numbers are a reference to the famous book 1984, written by George Orwell, which was released on June 8, 1949. So the assumption is that a possible release date for Phantom Pain could be June 8, 2015. What's the connection between the book and Phantom Pain, you ask? Well, for one, Phantom Pain actually takes place in the year 1984. Another connection is that if you think about it, the entity known as Big Brother from the book is very similar to the Patriots in that they are both constantly watching and manipulating the world and its people to their will. One final connection is that 1984 is the title of a song by David Bowie from his album Diamond Dogs, which was actually based on George Orwell's book 1984. The song 1984 came out on April 24th, 1974, while the album Diamond Dogs came out on May 24th, 1974. So the assumption is that other possible release dates include April 24th, 2015 or May 24th, 2015. The connections between 1984 and all these other things definitely seem to be there. I think now it's just a matter of finding a solid release date by decrypting these connections, and so far, we have 3 possible dates. If you have any other ideas for the hidden messages behind 1984, be sure to let us know in the comments below. And with that, I would like to conclude part 2 of Metal Gear Solid 5's trailer analysis, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. Once again, please be sure to let our nation know in the comments below your own theories, and don't be afraid to let us know if I made any mistakes or if there is anything that I missed. And to be further updated on Metal Gear Solid 5, be sure to join the nation and subscribe to Young Gear. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you very much, and Young out!